Hello there, BookTube. My name is Daniel. Welcome back to my channel, Guilty Feet. I wanna be loved by you, just you, and nobody else, but I've got no rhythm. And today I'm going to be talking about Arthur Miller, which is going to be probably even more self-indulgent than the other kinds of videos that I make, because I have a lot of books here that I want to talk about Arthur Miller, plays and other texts, and then I have some peripheral material about my times that I've interacted with Arthur Miller's work. And all this is prompted by my recent finishing of Arthur Miller's Salesman in Beijing, which is a diary of his time in, I think, 1983, where he was invited to direct a Chinese language version of Death of a Salesman in Beijing. The translation had been done by the actor who was playing Willy Loman, and he worked in collaboration with Miller to translate and work with the cast over it seemed like a relatively short period, like 6 or 8 weeks, at a time when China was just opening up, and for the first time in a good while, looking to the outside and looking to take on texts from outside the Chinese experience. And Death of a Salesman was thought to be an interesting bridge, because in some people's interpretation it was considered a very anti-American play, certainly at its time when Death of a Salesman was first produced in 1949, I believe, and this is now, he's coming to this sort of 35 years later and producing a Chinese language version of Death of a Salesman and trying to express some of the concepts in Death of a Salesman to an audience in China, which would have been very unfamiliar, both with anything American, and certainly these specific content. There was no such thing as traveling salesman in China at the time. It's one of the obstacles that he has to overcome explaining this and trying to navigate his way. Fascinating text, and had a jolly good time with it, but I thought I would use this as a jumping off point to talk about all these other things I have, Death of a Salesman. So probably encountered Arthur Miller, all things Arthur Miller. Probably encountered Arthur Miller about 14, 15. We studied The Crucible, I think was probably the first text of his that I knew, and we would have read that in school. It's a fantastic introduction to theatre and what it can do. The whole play, of course, set in the 17th century Salem witch trials, and yet as it's written and performed in 1940s America, it has a direct parallel with the witch hunt that's going on, the House Un-American Activities hunt for communist and communist sympathizers. So these parallels are very clear, even when this is explained to us in the 80s. I don't know what it's like 40 years on for students coming across this, where that has any lingering cultural relevance. But certainly felt real to us, and we were able to make the parallels, and people being accused and trying to hold on to their name, and everything they say is wrong. Well, maybe in the modern culture wars that does have some resonance. I imagine the Crucible still means something to people. So we'd studied that, and then in my last 2 years of high school, 11th and 12th grade in the UK, you focus, you just sort of finish your general studies up until about the end of 10th grade, where you do a wide range of subjects. And in the last couple of years, you focus. And one of my A levels that I was focusing on was English literature, for which I was assigned Death of a Salesman. So we study for 2 years. At the end of 2 years, you take an exam, and that's how you, based on the results of those exams, you get into university. So this is my copy of Death of a Salesman, introduction by E.R. Wood. I couldn't tell you E.R. Wood. This is my actual copy of Death of a Salesman that I was assigned in the first week of 11th grade. And I know that because it was clearly a brand new copy. There's the label. This is my school here. This is my name and the date, 18th of September, 1985, that this was assigned to me. And I never gave it back. Don't tell anybody. So love Death of a Salesman. Studied this for a couple of years. Feel close to the text. To the extent I would be concerned about going to see a production of this. I think I saw half a production once. We went one evening, a whole bunch of us drove to Eton, a very even more posh private school than the one I attended. It's where Boris Johnson went, and a whole bunch of British prime ministers attended Eton. And we went there to watch a school production of Death of a Salesman, and I think we were very snooty about it and left at halftime. But other than that, I've never seen a live production of Death of a Salesman. So that was my, as this is the first of his plays that I have. I also have a very falling apart, delicate copy here of both All My Sons and A View from the Bridge, which I bought, according to this, in 1988. So that's from 1985. I was starting my last 2 years of high school, finished summer 87, came to Israel for 2 years before going back and studying literature in London. And so I bought this at the book stop, it was called, in Yosef Tanoa Street in Jerusalem. And this is AA. That now The way, I don't know if they still does this, the way secondhand bookshops worked in Israel at that time, and maybe other places around the world, it's not an Israel thing, is that they would put letters in the books, and then there would be a handwritten list of the prices that those letters corresponded to, and that way they could just change the handwritten list, and they never had to change the price inside the book. But just to get a clear understanding, AA would have been the cheapest of the cheap. So that you A, through EE, and then A, B, C, D, all the way down to Z, which would be, so this would have been absolute pennies. This cost me, but it was good. It was to have a copy of more Arthur Miller. I thought that maybe, between school and university, I was going to study literature at university, and I thought maybe I would spend more time with Arthur Miller, which I did. So here's my copy of Youth and Bridge, All My Sons, both of which I have seen performed. And maybe, yes, I'll intersperse. So I've got here a whole bunch of theatre programmes from productions that I saw of Arthur Miller plays. There was a time, I'm in studying in London, 89 to 92, and then left London beginning of 96. So 92 to 95, I got married in 92, and my wife and I would go to theatre a fair bit. So I've got a whole bunch of things. Here's a copy of my programme from All My Sons, and a lot of these are actually from the Young Vic, which is a sort of, it's off West End. I don't know if you call it the Fringe. I think it's called Fringe Theatre. There's the Old Vic, which is the classic theatre on the South Bank, and then just down the road is the Young Vic, which always had sort of fresher, perhaps more sparse productions. But we end up going there a lot because it's cheap, and as students we get very cheap tickets to go and see. And they had a lot of, and for some reason at that period in time they were doing a lot of Arthur Miller. He was still alive at this time, still writing new stuff, and I've got a couple of programs from new first run plays of his. But they would do a lot of revivals of classic plays, and I guess just from a business perspective, doing something like All My Sons, doing something like The Crucible, I've got also somewhere in there. It's a way of guaranteeing ticket sales because school groups are going to come and see these productions. So it's kind of business model slash Miller was a living, working, well-respected playwright. And this is, these plays are being put on sort of 30, 40 years after they first appeared. Schools are studying them. So that's the whole model here. But I always like looking through these programs, seeing if there's anyone in these productions that I may have seen that went on to become even more famous. So this, and I love the fact they've got this great picture of Arthur Miller on the cover, because in the end he's more of a selling point than maybe even the content of the play. All My Sons, one of his first hits, really dealing with the morality of war, morality within families. Who have we got here? We've got Ian Bannon, great Scottish actor. I got that right. Playing Joe Keller. What other names here? Marjorie Yates will have, she's directed by David Thacker, who was a great, may still be a great theatre director. Who else? Matthew Marsh playing Chris Keller. I think I've also got, Matthew Marsh, if I remember correctly, is the name on there. So here's also from the Young Vic. This is from The Crucible. This is not barely a programme, it's just 2 sheets. And I believe, yes, Matthew Marsh, who I don't know who he is or where he is today, even if he was playing John Proctor in this production, I remember that name. But I don't know many of the other names in this. Corin Redgrave would be Vanessa's brother, also directed by David Thacker. And this is a bit early. So this is from 85, 86. So this is while I'm still in school. And then this production, All My Sons, is a little bit later. View from Bridge, I also have. I also saw a production of View from Bridge. This is a national theatre. Again, not much of a programme. This is just a pamphlet. Does it have a date on this? Opening February 87. So again, I'm still in high school. This is before I finished high school. And playing Eddie Carbone, if you know A View from the Bridge, what Miller had referred to as the Italian play. Playing Eddie Carbone in this production was Michael Gambon. The great Michael Gambon. I guess you can kind of see him there long before he took over as Dumbledore. Yes, 30 years before he took over as Dumbledore. Who else in this production? Anybody we know? Adrian, I don't know. Anyway, what else have I got here? A couple of other plays then that I picked up in university. I've got here a copy of After the Fall, sometimes considered one of Miller's most autobiographical plays. We have Quentin and Maggie is his blonde, sensual wife, and the breakdown of the relationship between them was said to mirror aspects of Miller's life. I think later on there was a production of After the Fall put on in London with Josette Simon, a black actress playing Maggie, and that was considered very counterintuitive, as Maggie was always meant to be a stand-in, or was considered to be a stand-in for Marilyn Monroe. So that was kind of counterintuitive casting, and I saw a bit of that. I've got something about that in a second. So that's After the Fall. Well worth visiting. Probably not tier one Miller, but fantastic. I also have a copy here of The Price, which is probably a little known Miller play, and I might not have known anything about it, except again it was something that young Vic put on, and so I have here again they're using that same picture, different colouring. This is barely a brochure; it's just a sort of opening. What's that in it? Oh no, that's something else. It's from another play altogether. And this was a four-hander, so a small play, and I saw this with the great Bob Peck playing Walter Franz, David Calder playing Victor, again directed by David Thacker. So clearly, as a director at the Young Vic, he was looking for more and more Miller material to put on. This had the great experience of being a Miller play that was revived, but I knew nothing about it. So I saw this production completely fresh. I hadn't read, didn't have a copy of the play, I hadn't read it at the time. And it was astonishing, just a fantastic. If you get a chance to see The Price, or if you read The Price, it's just a great piece of theatre for people. You know, there are bigger Miller productions. The Crucible is often put on in schools because there's parts for lots of people. Death of a Salesman is a complicated play because it's so inside his head, as the original title for the play, or something similar. The Price is just a classic piece of four-handed theatre, and really terrific. So I was pleased to have seen that. Again, another sort of young Vic production with that picture. It's not the last time you'll see that picture. What else have I got here? Another couple of books, and then I'll go through the rest of the brochures and see what I've got. I have here a really beaten up Dell paperback, Arthur Miller, The Misfits. The Misfits was a play for which Miller wrote the screenplay. And this, I guess, I don't know if it's a novelization or he wrote it as a book. This was a film starring, you've got Marilyn Monroe there, you have Clark Gable, you have the beautiful Montgomery Clift, and it's just a elegiac, sad little movie about these misfits, and terrific. And I don't think it necessarily works as a book. I think it's a movie that, even as a movie, probably works better as stills than as a complete work. I'm not saying it's a failure by any stretch, but just these faces are iconic and fading at the time that you're seeing them here. But that's a nice little. I say this is falling apart again. This is bought in Sefer V'Sefer in 1989. So this is still when before I come back to London. This is L, so maybe I paid a little bit more. Sefer V'Sefer is a shop still open in Israel. Sefer V'Sefer means book and mug because it was a combined second-hand bookshop and little cafe. The second-hand bookshop is still there. The place where they used to sit out and serve brownies and muffins is there, but I don't think they serve food anymore. So it's called Sefer, it's still called Book and Mug, but I don't think the mug part has any significance. That's The Misfits by Arthur Miller. What else have I got? I've got a copy of Plain Girl, tiny little novella. What is this, 70 pages? Again, I don't think significant, other than at the time this was published. The great coup that Arthur Miller's publishing something. So this is early 90, first published in Great Britain in 95, first published in the States in 92. Wow, it took 3 years to be published. Interesting. And published in America as Homely Girl. So they've anglicized or Briticized the title from Homely, which I think British people would understand Homely. Odd choice, 3 years after it's originally published, to publish in the UK as Plain Girl. Again, I don't think this is a particularly significant thing, certainly as 70 pages that have bounced off me, and I've carried on going regardless. I'll do that one last, and just also have a copy here of an actual novel that he wrote, Focus, which is much earlier. This is published, I think, originally in 1949, so at the peak of his powers as a playwright, he puts out a novel, and this novel is about a man who puts on a pair of glasses, and so his world comes into focus, and starts to experience the world differently since he wears glasses. And whether it's explicit or implicit, the sense is that as he's walking around with the glasses, people treat him differently. And I think it's quite a sort of unsophisticated metaphor for anti-Semitism, and how the world treats different people as other. Miller was never a terribly Jewish, in case that's not clear, born in 1915. Doesn't write a whole lot about being a Jew. He was an atheist and married 3 times, never to a Jewish woman. So not hugely involved and immersed in Jewish culture and Jewish communities, but every now and then he peripherally touches, and I have one play that I'll talk about in a second that deals with it. That's his novel focus, and I have here, falling apart, my edition of Time Bends, which was at this point when this is published, this was a brand new autobiography. This was again a big deal, and my mother bought this for me. Because I was a fan of Arthur Miller. So this book comes out in '87. So I come back to the UK after being away for 2 years, and I think she must have bought this, or maybe she even sent it to me in Israel, which is why it's all ripped and torn. I may have had this in my suitcase while I was traveling around here. And it's a fantastic book. It's got some great pictures. I remember, it's a great read and was a great reference when I was studying Miller later on. Look at him as a young man. Handsome fella. And a man's man. He was a carpenter, and he built his shed in the garden where he wrote his plays. And one second, one other picture, iconic picture that I think is worth visiting. I'm sure I will find a picture of, maybe not, maybe there's not even one here, of Arthur Miller, and that's one of the great pop cultural images of all time. Arthur Miller, the intellectual, acclaimed Pulitzer Prize winning playwright, and Marilyn Monroe, iconic woman in her own right. Just a fabulous, relaxed picture. One of the things that I remember very clearly from this, Miller, he doesn't write a whole lot about, people waited for this book to come out and they were thinking he was going to spill the beans, because he'd never said very much about his time with Marilyn Monroe. They were married for a brief while and then divorced, but he only has good things to say about her in the book. And I remember very clearly one of the ways he describes it as being a hugely empathetic human being. And he says that she would walk into a room with a whole bunch of people, and she could immediately identify who was in psychic pain, or who had some story, who was suffering in some way mentally, and would find the person and sit and talk to them. And I'm not saying seeking out others' pain, but she was very sensitive with her background and her the life that she had lived. She was very sensitive and warm to others, and he always found that admirable. Anyway, enough about Marilyn Monroe. I have here a postcard with this great picture of Arthur Miller, and this is signed by the man himself. I went to see him talk in it would have been National Theatre, my wife and I, an evening with Arthur Miller, and we sat through a whole bunch of we put up with a whole bunch of questions from the audience, some of them super irritating to him. Clearly he was a bit of a grumpy old man at this point, and I remember very clearly someone, a drama teacher, so he, standing up at the back and had a very long, convoluted question. He was putting on a production of one of Miller's early, barely produced works that's in the canon, and you'll find in the collected plays, but I don't think it was ever on Broadway. And he had read that Miller had rewritten the opening scene 32 times, and could he explain a little bit about what it was that he was missing and what he kept having to fix? And Miller looked at him, talking about a play that no one has ever seen, that he wrote 50 years prior, and said, I have absolutely no idea. And a big laugh, and this guy had built up this big question, and clearly it was more about proving how much he knew about Arthur Miller. And when he turned to the man himself, the man looked at him like, why would anyone care about this? Anyway, I queued up afterwards to shake his hand and thank him for the impact he had on my life. I didn't have anything with me to sign, so I bought a postcard in the lobby of the National Theatre, and he signed his postcard on the back to me. And just a couple more things. I have another Young Vic production. I said there'd be one more picture. This image again on a Young Vic program, and this is The Man Who Had All the Luck, which predates his Broadway success. This opened and closed on Broadway very quickly. It was a big failure, and it took for the Crucible and David Salesman winning Pulitzer for Arthur Miller to establish himself. But this was then revived many years later, again at the Young Vic. Interesting, in this cast I've got here playing the young David Beeves is Ian Glenn, who will be familiar to Game of Thrones fans. Who else have we got in here? Also, Patterson Beeves. They're playing, I think, his baby brother, Colin Farrell. If you'd tortured me, I could not have told you that I'd seen Colin Farrell live on the stage and stood 30 feet away from him, but it turns out that I did. Also, Ed Bishop in here. If you're a fan of 1970s TV sci-fi, he's the guy from UFO. So that's a man had all the luck. A minor work, but a great opportunity to have seen that performed live. What else have I got here? Yeah, this was a handbook from the Save the Young Vic festival. So they were going through funding issues, and they put on an evening wishing Arthur Miller happy birthday. So I've got here, this is like a really old, this is pre-computers, this would have been typed and then mimeographed page where they ran through an evening celebrating Arthur Miller, and they've got like one scene from a whole bunch of plays. So I've got something here from the Golden Years, early Miller. Then The Man Had All the Luck with someone else playing David Beeves, not Ian Glenn. Then you've got a clip from All My Sons, Warren Mitchell, the great Warren Mitchell, Alf Garnett playing Willie Loman in a scene with just Willie and Linda. There's Warren Mitchell's name. I would have seen him. Then you've got a whole big cast doing part of An Enemy of the People, Miller's version of the Ibsen play with Tom Wilkinson, the great Tom Wilkinson from Full Monty and Michael Clayton and the Dark Knight movie. I think the first Dark. Anyway, you'll know Tom Wilkinson if you see him. Anybody the names there? So he's playing Thomas Stockman. Then also playing Tom Wilkinson, also playing John Proctor in The Crucible with Zoe Wanamaker playing Elizabeth Proctor. You've got David Calder doing Eddie Carbone from View from the Bridge. Also David Calder in The Price. And then a scene each from The American Clock. Susanna York, the great Susanna York playing Rose in American Clock, and then a clip from After the Fall, Quentin and Maggie and Josette Simon. So she played at the National and playing Maggie also in this little scene that I saw. So that would have been a great evening. Also at the Young Vic, celebrating Arthur Miller and getting to see snippets from all his plays. That's the kind of thing that we did when we were young marrieds or young students in London. This is one of the things I miss most about London. Then a new production, A Broken Glass. This is one of the last new plays that was put on by Miller, and this was the London premiere. So again, now early 90s, and I've got in this also Ed Bishop again from UFO, Henry Goodman, great Henry Goodman. You'd recognise that. Well, yeah, that's Henry Goodman there. You'll know him if you see him. And that's Ken Stott, also a famous Scottish actor, and he's done a whole bunch of stuff as well. So that's Broken Glass, great play. And then the last thing I have to show you is this thing. Which I'm not going to show you at all, but this is my undergraduate thesis on family relationships in the work of Arthur Miller, and all beautifully typed and bound. I mean, that's how we rolled in 1999. Before there were computers, before there were files, I sat down. I'd handwritten this by hand, and then sat down with a typewriter and went through this, and it's got some interesting. So I've got subscripts for the bibliography. So that's quite. I don't know how I did that. A little number there, 20, pointing to a bibliography at the back, and all the names of the texts are all underlined. Yeah, this is pretty impressive. There's my bibliography at the back with primary sources and secondary sources. I mean, I think it's absolutely terrible, hopeless piece of academia. But just as a memory of my time with Arthur Miller, I think it works. As I say, I just finished Salesman, so I haven't read much Arthur Miller over the years. I haven't had a chance to see any of his plays in the last 20 years or so. But I found a copy of this last year or 18 months ago when I was in Westport, Connecticut, in a sort of library overflow shop, and picked this up. And so pleased that I came back and read this. It just reminded me of his thoughtfulness. He's a man of the theatre. Like some of the great things in this is where he's discussing the lighting and the sound cues, and obviously how difficult it is to do it because they've only got one broken down tape recorder, and that breaks down the sound cues and the which trigger the memories or indicate that we are moving from reality into a memory in the play Death of a Salesman are so important. So he's got a lot of concerns that the tape recorder is going to break down, and the light, why the lighting, how the reality is lit as opposed to the memories are lit. The whole he's just a person who lives and breathes theatre in a way that when you perhaps see the work and you experience it, you forget that this is a separate skill, that this writing is so different. It's then meant to be experienced. The rhythms of the language. It talks about the pacing of the play and how in translation, originally in Chinese, it runs about an hour and a half longer than the play's supposed to run, and he has to drill the actors in finding the rhythm and talking faster again, because this is a very specific way that it's supposed to be delivered, and eventually trim it down, and it runs maybe 2 minutes longer than the original American production, but still a bit shorter than German and the French translation. And all these things I found fascinating. So I got a lot out of this. Love this. Love Arthur Miller. Had the privilege of shaking his hand, at meeting him that once. Not that that means anything, but just a whole bunch of things. And that's my time with Arthur Miller. I guess this is probably something I'll revisit more than I expect anyone else to enjoy watching this. But if you do, thanks for watching. Take care. Bye.